It's another thing for a group of Black singers and actors to reenact scenes of slavery, to reenact ideas of oppression, to deal with complicated and controversial language, in front of an audience that might be primarily white or just, people with certain sensitivities or who haven't been exposed to certain ideas of history or even want to see history in certain ways that this poem is averse to.
And welcome to the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, Broad Street Review Podcast Season 10. It is still blowing my mind how many episodes we've had this season. There's just been a ton of great conversations about the amazing art that is in and around the Philadelphia area. And we're so excited to continue having these conversations. Today, we're taking a trip to Opera Philadelphia to talk about an upcoming piece called The Black Clown. And it is a Philadelphia premiere, an adaptation of the Langston Hughes poem by the same name. And I'm here with the co-creator, Davóne Tines.
Hello,
welcome
good to see
the
you.
Podcast.
Lovely to see you.
We were just talking, when we weren't recording, that you actually have connections here in Philadelphia.
I do. I've performed a lot with the Philadelphia Orchestra and sang in recital there as well. And I also have some new artistic friends and collaborators. One particular incredible performer named Rose has been a great bridge from me in New York to understanding and getting to know, the more internal Philadelphia performing arts community.
Awesome. It's always great to know that there are connections that bring us all back to Philadelphia in some way. So let's before we get into the Black Clown, let's learn about Davóne Tines. Tell us about you.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm a singer and creator, and I consider myself that for a couple different reasons. Yes, a lot of my work is within the operatic realm, but I also move to music and performing spaces well outside of opera, or even just pushing the bounds of opera. And it means that the singing is not all what one might traditionally think of as classical or operatic. So the Black Clown in particular moves through so many different styles from the Black diaspora, and even incorporates aspects of Western classical music in a subtle way. But I also have a band called The Truth, and we do all kinds of soul and even things that are, referencing Paul Robeson. And then in terms of creator, I am a co-creator of this piece. And I've also been making large-scale artworks for various museums, various installation works in New York and in LA. And so I like to think about my work in a kind of expanded field of art making. That's why my Instagram handle is also an opera singer, because hopefully, I can be multitudes, and then opera singing can be a part of that. But I kind of say that just as a means of saying everybody is made of many, many composite parts, and we don't all have to be one thing. In fact, we are not all one thing at one time.
Absolutely. We're all multidisciplinary. Those hats, they make sense because they all inspire everything. Whatever our primary path is inspired by so many other forms. Yeah, it is hard. Definitely when I talk to artists, it's hard to nail down the thing that you do. Like, you can't really, the elevator pitch is not really an elevator pitch. You can't really button it down because there's so many things that inspire us all.
Completely.
Which is wonderful. Well, it's great to know that all those many genres inspire you. I was going to ask you, did you ever see your path leading towards opera? And if you did, was there a moment in time where it became more clear?
No, not at all. I didn't realize that I might be interested in opera until college. I grew up in rural Northern Virginia. Music making was in the Black Baptist Church. And then also I started playing piano when I was very young in elementary school, and then moved to violin in middle school and high school. So I always had this kind of bifurcated experience of music making. One was in a, more classical style, and the other was in a more communal, familial style. And of course, coming from different histories and different racial and aesthetic contexts. It was actually my grandfather who realized that I had a unique and potentially operatic voice. We were playing. He's very charismatic and funny and was singing in like a funny operatic way. And I kind of mimicked him and he was blown away. And I wasn't really trying to do something, but I could make those kinds of sounds. And so he encouraged me to pursue lessons and pursue, what I could do to actually train my voice. And so in college, I went to Harvard for undergrad, and there's lots of performing arts opportunities with student-led opera companies and different choral groups. So I got a little more into the world of, singing in a formal way. And that led me to realize that I really did have a passion for what opera could be, not necessarily what it always has been or was, but seeing a lot of potential in the art form and realizing I could be a voice in its evolution.
Did you ever think about whether there was sort of a void or a lack of diversity in the opera space?
Yeah, no. So in undergrad, I studied sociology. I actually started, as a focusing in music, but the department there at the time was all history and pedagogy and theory, and I was more interested in practice and performing. So I actually looked around and realized sociology was a field that I was more turned on by because I grew up in a complicated, multifaceted context. I existed in one in Harvard, so many different races, socioeconomic classes, and histories colliding. Sociology really gave me a lens to understand the complexities of the world, the psychology of groups of people. Looking at opera, it's just obvious that there's a certain, lack of diversity, at least in the versions of it that are more supported and seen. But in fact, there are very long traditions of many different cultures, and especially Black culture, contributing to the art form, for decades and decades. And only now are those contributions being more recognized, but also a part of entering the operatic world was realizing it was a complicated journey in order for me to try to engage all of what I brought, from my history and culture to that context and not have the context limit how I could fully realize myself.
Yeah. That's great. So let's get into the Black Clown. Let's talk about that. When did this first enter into your brain, and when did you start thinking about how this could be, an operatic piece?
Yeah, the inspiration to make something that was very personal happened maybe, what was this? A few years after getting out of undergrad before I went to grad school. I remember sitting, I used to have a church job singing at the National Shrine, which is like the seat of the Catholic Church in the United States in Washington, D.C. And it was a really wonderful place to make music. I mean, it was a very well paid job. And also the choir was all professionals. And we were singing all this incredible, classical choral repertoire, early music and modern things. But I wasn't so connected to the religious practice. I grew up in a Baptist context. And so I felt, disconnected from this very different way of approaching faith. And I kind of yearned to sing music that actually was more personal, that I could, really get excited about being close to the subject matter and close to the aesthetics. So I wrote a friend from undergrad, Mike Schachter, who's also a co-creator and composer on the piece. And I wrote him this email in 2011 that was basically saying, I'm sitting, in the homily at the National Shrine and I'm really bored. And I would love for us to collaborate on creating something that I feel more personally excited about. And I described some notions of maybe it being like dark and whimsical, being very soulful. And so through email exchange, we settled on exploring Langston Hughes. And actually, Michael's wife, Ali Schachter, who I went to school with as well, had just gifted him a volume of Langston Hughes' complete works, which is kind of a rare sort of publication. And in that, we found a very underseen poem called The Black Clown and a little collection of poems called The Negro Mother. And really fascinatingly, Hughes invents his own structure of a poem where there are two columns. One is titled The Poem and the other is titled The Mood. And these were meant to be performed, in front of an audience, a recitation where the mood describes what should be going on while the poem is being read or how the speaker should, act or comport themselves. And so we realized there were very clear instructions on how to realize something musically if you use what he says in the mood to musicalize what's happening in the poem. And so we went through, just a fun process over maybe a year and a half, 2 years of making some songs based on the poem. And it turned into a 25-minute long group of songs. And then I started thinking, when I perform this in front of people, what am I going to do? There's so much suggestion and theatricality. Do I wear a costume? Are there, special lighting or anything, something beyond just a recital? And that got me to thinking, well, maybe this is a bigger theatrical thing. I talked to a really amazing colleague, Diane Wandisford, who produces a lot of new musical works and workshops them in New York. She's very open-minded, and I showed her the idea, and she said, you know what? You should actually take this idea to the American Repertory Theater, where I actually had worked as an intern maybe 3 years before then. And I met with the producers there, and we sang through the piece, and they said, we are really interested in helping you develop this. They really incredibly provided Michael and I resources and space over 3 years to just be together in Boston and travel just to work on the piece. It wasn't a formal commission at that point, but just kind of, an invitation to keep working. And then after about 3 years of going through many, many different ideas and drafts, it was finally in a place where they said, okay, now we can officially commission this piece because the vision is very clear. There's a lot of understanding of what this could be. And at that point, I thought a lot about who is the director, and we had many, many meetings. And it's like, does the director have to be Black, or what is the demographic of the director and how does that work? And we weren't really finding anybody. Funny enough, one day in the shower where I get all my best ideas, I had an epiphany that the director should actually be one of my best friends, a director and producer, Zach Winokur, who is a white Jewish man. But I realized that, one, I loved his aesthetic and theatricality and way to make things that are really fun, but also searing, and that it was okay to use a white director because Hughes points his poem at a white audience. He says, you laugh because I'm poor and Black and funny. He's saying that to white people. So in order for me to get the message I want to say across, it was useful to utilize a white director as the bridge to a white audience. So we went through 3 more years of workshopping, and then we finally premiered the work in 2018. It went to Lincoln Center in 2019, and finally it's coming back to Opera Philadelphia.
How did you feel when it was officially on its legs and it was in front of a grand audience like that?
Yeah, it was a combination of exhilaration and surreality, very surreal to realize that, something that I dreamed up maybe 8 years prior had turned into a full show with a 13-member cast and all Black band and gorgeous sets made by these incredible designers that, work with Solange and all these other pop stars. And I mean, it was beyond what I could ever imagine. And to do a 30 performance run of that and have it be so beautifully welcomed and received, it was beyond imagination.
It seems like things kind of lined up. You reach out to a friend, you start brainstorming, you partner with an organization, they give you space to think about it and resources. And then they say, okay, now we're ready. Let's commission it.
Mhm.
And then, you pull all the pieces together and you bring it all there. Were there any obstacles that stood in the way of this during the process? Or were there ever any times where you were like, I don't know what I got myself into? Like, am I going to keep doing this? Or, did you hit some kind of thing that made you rethink it all?
Definitely, over and over and over again, because, yes, Hughes's words are very clear, and what he, implicates about how these words should be delivered is very clear. But we realize there's so much complication when you put those actions on bodies in space in front of people. It's one thing for someone to stand up and read a poem. It's another thing for a group of Black singers and actors to reenact scenes of slavery, to reenact ideas of oppression, to deal with complicated and controversial language, in front of an audience that might be primarily white or just, people with certain sensitivities or who haven't been exposed to certain ideas of history or even want to see history in certain ways that this poem is averse to. And so we went through so many different drafts of, how does this thing, move through the idea of oppression in America over 300 years. What is good to show? What is complicated and needs to be changed? There's kind of at least two quick examples of those turning points. One was a draft that we had written that was, I don't know. I don't fully know how to say. It's like almost was cartoonish or kind of a caricature of the idea. And this was a very internal document. This is internal to the creators, not saying like, this is the actual piece and a synopsis, but accidentally that internal draft with this kind of madcap realization of everything was sent to a prospective choreographer who responded, in an extremely concerned way, saying, how could this be the story that you're trying to tell and the way that you're trying to tell it? And that was really horrifying because, our internal imaginings of what we could do were seen, outside of that, very sacred creative bubble and then misseen and misjudged. And why that was part of our internal creative process is, in order to find what to make, I always talk about you have to like find where the walls and the boundaries are. You have to go to certain places honestly just to understand, oh, that is a wall, that is a block. And that really made us rethink, how this complicated history gets told and how people externally will engage it. And another example during the workshop staging process is we get to the song 300 Years, which is about 300 years of slavery in America. And we were really, well, I guess before what I'm wanting to say is about inspiration, there's just a moment where people maybe need to suggest some of the violence or complications of Black bodies existing in a slavery and oppressive context. And so we tried in a very gentle way to say, what if you take on this action if you're in a field or if there's maybe the suggestion of a violent interracial interaction? And we very quickly realized that that was pushing hard against a boundary of, psychological safety for this all Black cast and even myself. And we had to stop rehearsal. We had to really take a big moment to sit down and reflect and externalize and address caringly and intentionally, what this sort of enactment could bring up. And we came to the solution of being very inspired by the work of Kara Walker, who's, one of my favorite artists. And now we've actually had the opportunity to collaborate recently. Her work, her earlier period of making silhouettes really was incredible because you can look at really complicated things, but have a bit of mitigation through the flattening of the image and through the way that, it's almost like things are backlit. So you don't have to engage fully the individual humanity, but you see the form of the actions. So how we translated that was putting up a huge scrim, like a huge screen or like a sheet almost, and projecting light from the back of the stage. So you only see shadows of these actions. And interestingly enough, that sort of veil or sheet or scrim created enough of a physical boundary between these inactions of the Black cast and an audience that it also felt psychologically protective. So that's just one of the, points in this journey of realizing how do you tell these works with clarity, but also sensitivity.
It's so interesting as you were saying that when you were talking about Tara Walker and the silhouettes, I was thinking about so many movies and television that have been depicting tough moments in animation and puppetry, and because they're hard to deal with, and it's like how do you put actual bodies into this situation? It's like maybe we should we'll use this other medium to tell that story, and it is pointing out it's like this is bright and vibrant because it's animation, for example, but it's a really tough situation that we're going through here. And it's just so interesting how we can use all these other elements to really kind of to get through those points without really harming people. As you were talking about that song, I was thinking about the self-care and how an ensemble protects itself. And I imagine there are just moments of this piece that just take it out of all of you. And what is sort of the process of checking in with each other before or after this piece that allows you to then sort of reset to do it again or to kind of be out in public with
Right.
the people again?
In the rehearsal room, there's a very special way of working with my closest friends and colleagues that is very intentional about who the individuals are within a piece. So we try to get to know everyone fairly closely, kind of quickly, just to say, you're not just a person that's a cog in this machine, but you're an individual with your own history and lived experiences. And how can we be vigilant about how your identity, jives with this work. So there's that aspect of it. There's a lot of checking in, actually, and there's a lot of discourse woven into rehearsal about the poem. So it's not just throwing it on its feet, but it's saying, these are the words of Hughes. We are always going to revisit them. We are always going to have an open discussion about how we interpret these words. It's never just read the script and do the show. It's how are you today? How do you connect to this work today? But also, incredibly, the idea of the taking care or healing is built into the piece itself because it's how Hughes actually builds the arc of the poem. You start in a kind of place of power by making a statement, and then you walk through a history that goes, deeper and deeper into darker places. But then the last third or so of the poem is this huge ascent, from the bottoms of oppression to self-realization of resilience, and then to a place of joy in the last song that's called Say to All Foemen. And it's about, casting off your naysayers. And we made it, an extremely up-tempo, bright, and glorious gospel song. So it's really important to, if you bring people to some place that's complicated and dark, that you also have a ramp for them to end with healing and joy. So by the end of the piece, we've already walk through a place where we can depart the piece, with that sense of joy.
Can you talk about what can we expect visually as we are in that space and we're getting settled in? What can we expect our senses to be taking in?
Yeah. So the set is kind of magical in that there's not a lot there, but a lot of different atmospheres and moods and kinds of spaces are made. And that is the genius of two incredible designers that Zach and I love working with. The production designer and costume designer and historian, essentially, Carlos Soto, and the incredible lighting designer, John Torres. They've worked together over many, many years and have such a unique pedigree in that they both started working with a director called Robert Wilson, who is a formative force in contemporary opera and kind of creating a really rich visual world. And then they took what they mined from, these visuals that are very clear and sleek and vibrant, and they've applied it to the more popular world. So Carlos has worked a lot with Solange to help her realize her aesthetic. John Torres lights so many parts of Fashion Week. Both of them had hands in working on Cowboy Carter, Beyonce's tour and all sorts of other things. So they're taking their deep contemporary and modern art practice and applying it to a more popular realm. And so our production gets this incredible level of specificity and aesthetic world that is just gorgeous and kind of in a place of art that rises above just simple theatrics and actually moves to a place of sculpture and scale.
What do you hope the audience takes away from this experience?
I hope the audience is able to really digest the poem. That's why we wanted to do it. There are no other words in the show except for what Hughes writes down. And a goal of the show is to present that poem as richly as possible. So we repeat words a lot. Phrases continue to, happen over and over again so that you can really let the words sink in. And so I hope the audience takes away their own guttural emotional reactions to the genius of what Hughes has created. And I hope that they're able to understand other people through empathetic eyes, and the notion that if you consider an individual within the context of their entire history, you might treat them differently.
Amazing. Well, I was sold before I had the chat with you, and I can't wait to be in that space to experience this piece. Everyone, The Black Clown. It's a Philadelphia premiere and adaptation of the Langston Hughes poem by the same name, co-created by Davóne Tines. This production is at Opera Philly, which will be at the Miller Theater from May 14th to May 17th. And if you know about Opera Philly. They've been working really hard to make their work as accessible as possible, and all tickets are pick your price starting at $11. So there is no reason why you can't join us in the space to be a part of this conversation. Davóne Tines, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. This is really exciting, and I can't wait to be in that space. I have tickets on the 15th. I was talking to my friends about it last night, and I got a couple of them to join us. So we're excited to be there. But thank you so much. This was truly a pleasure.
Thank you, and can't wait to see you there.